Everyone, I know people will be joining us and hopefully over lunch today. Thank you very much for joining. I am Carla Wilshire, CEO of the Migration Council Australia, today we have the National Workforce Competencies for Settlement Practitioners launch. We have David Wilden from the department joining us to officially launch the competencies, as well as a fantastic panel. So I will just briefly introduce everyone. So David Wilden is First Assistant Secretary for Refugee, Humanitarian and Settlement Division. And while I've got him on this call, I know from talking to David that he waited almost his whole career to join the settlement section, and it was the one thing he wanted to do. And I think as a sector, we're incredibly lucky to have in David a public servant that is so committed and so passionate about settlement. I know he has very much gone into bat for settlement, you know, particularly around all sorts of things like budget processes and in particular around the additional money that the settlement sector got in relation to assistance for migrant and refugee women. And I think, you know, in the context of COVID and with borders closed, that we've had this amount of support from the department is just fantastic. So I really want to thank David for being here today, but also for all the work that he does. And we also have a fantastic panel that I'll briefly introduce before handing over to Anna. So we have on our panel, Paris Aristotle, who almost everyone would know. When I first started working with the settlement sector, getting close to 15 years ago now, Paris was described to me in my very first day as, you need to talk to this guy, Paris Aristotle. He is the Grand Master of the settlement sector. So very pleased to be able to have him on today. Could have been worse. It could have been grandfather of the settlement sector, Paris. Obviously, Paris's work in particular around torture and trauma, but also his work in leading RAMSAC, the Advisory Council, really, I think, brings a lot. We have Rana, who is from the Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network Australia, or MYAN, one of our sister bodies, who obviously contributed quite significantly in terms of putting a youth lens onto the competency. So really appreciate having her today. Here today we have Christine Castley, who is the new Chief Executive Officer of Multicultural Australia, but Christine also has significant expertise as the Deputy Director General from the Queensland Department of Premier and Cabinet, many years in the public service leading innovative projects, and in particular she led the Secretariat for the Special Task Force for Domestic and Family Violence that was chaired by Quentin Bryce. If anyone hasn't read it, should read Not Now, Not Ever, the report that was produced out of it, because it really was exceptional. And we have Bernie Knott, who was instrumental as well, his organisation contributing to the competencies. With over 25 years experience in community service, Bernie now leads one of the settlement providers in Melbourne, Spectrum, and really happy to have him on the panel as well. Before I go on and hand over to Anna, I really wanted to thank everybody, because we did have a lot of contribution right across the board into the competencies. So this has been very much a sector-led approach, and I really appreciate everyone who did contribute to this. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Anna, I'll ask you to do a couple of minutes before we hand over to David.
Thank you so much, Carla. I'm just going to go through a quick presentation to talk about what is actually covered in the competencies, so everyone has an understanding. So to start off with, everyone who's seen it understands that these workforce competencies have been built to cover all different levels of workers that we find within our space. The volunteer level, the entry level for junior practitioners or for trainees, the immediate level for caseworkers, case managers, trainers or community development practitioners, as well as advanced level generalists for managers and specialist practitioners in particular areas. And there are different domains within the competencies, and they cover different aspects of the work. So I'm just going to go through which competencies fit within each of those domains. You'll see within the competency document that under each competency, there are different behaviours that are covered, and they clearly mark which of the levels of practitioners these apply to and give a description of what that looks like. So the principles of settlement practice that apply across all of the domains include person-centred, agency-centred, strengths-based, evidence-based, intersectionality-based, and culturally responsive and trauma-informed, which we'll discuss further in the panel discussion. The first domain, the foundations of settlement practice, includes promoting the principles of settlement practice, which I just described, advocating for individual settlement needs, and facilitating community capacity building. The second domain looks at some specialist areas that people work in across the sector, which include providing specialist settlement support in employment, providing specialist support in youth settlement, providing specialist settlement support to enhance mental well-being and recovery, and specialist settlement support in family and domestic violence. Then we look at communication to proactively manage interactions with all stakeholders and manage information sharing and documentation. We also look at collaboration, which is essential to engage in collaborative practice with all stakeholders across organisational and sectoral boundaries to maintain partnerships with colleagues based on trust and manage tension and conflict. Professionalism, which is something that we all want for our sector, to maintain reflective practice and professional boundaries, high standards of conduct, contributing to a culture of safety and improvement, and managing our own health and well-being. Then we go into the decision-making domain, which doesn't necessarily apply to all levels of practitioners, but looks at taking adaptive, collaborative, rigorous, and solution-oriented approaches to decision-making, adapting to changing situations, which we've all got very good at, contributing to risk management. And finally, the leadership domain looks at a specific process of crafting a vision, building alignment, and championing execution. So all of that will be found in the document. We're going to post a link in the chat so that you can access the document and have a look as we go through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Lovely. And David, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you for your very kind words earlier. Ending up my public service career, if you like, in settlement and the refugee area was always a goal. So I'm glad that just on 12 months ago I was able to start in this position. First thing, I'll apologise for my hair. We have had lockdown, and tomorrow afternoon I will be attending to this rather messy mop, so you'll just have to tolerate for now. I'd just like to do a quick acknowledgement of country as well. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting today, and in Canberra that's the Ngunnawal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their leaders past, present and emerging, and a special welcome today to anyone online who is from an Indigenous background. Thank you very much for inviting me to launch the National Workforce Competencies for Settlement Practitioners. The launch marks a great achievement by the Migration Council of Australia, who continues to be a steadfast and impressive leader for the settlement sector. MCA's ongoing efforts toward capacity building for the settlement sector, particularly through the SETS community of practice, and more recently expanding this work into the important area of supporting the government's domestic and family violence initiatives, is greatly appreciated. So thank you to MCA, SETS practitioners and all those members of the community of practice who have done such great work preparing these competency standards over the last year or so. The launch of the National Workforce Competencies today is of particular significance for the settlement sector. But before I get to that, I'll just declare my hand at this point. I have a deep and abiding interest in competency standards and their ability to frame the appropriate training and development for individuals, occupations and sectors. In the early 1990s, I worked on the development of competencies for the Australian Public Service as part of the government's Working Nation program. For the kids on the show today, you can look that up. There was a bloke called Paul Keating, he was Prime Minister, and there was a big body of work that we did over a number of years. I worked in one of the teams of the Public Service Commission that developed, with other government agencies, common standards, curriculum, and importantly, the tools for recognition of current competence that enabled staff who had not had the opportunity or interest in pursuing formal study to receive recognition as part of the Australian Standards Framework for the skills they possessed and used. They were valuable as they reflected the skills of the broader industry in which an occupation may nest, not just specifically the APS skills. And I think that's very important for these settlement competencies as well. The APS standards were complementary to industry standards, and this was particularly important where the specialist jobs in the APS were both part of a profession and the employment just happened to be in the APS, such as social workers in Centrelink. And while standards have been in and out of vogue a little bit since the early 90s, the value of the competency-based approach has proven itself over the years in multiple contexts. Importantly, the National Workforce Competencies for Settlement Practitioners will further strengthen the settlement sector while promoting a culture of continuous improvement through supporting and informing ongoing learning and development of the settlement workforce, guiding education, training and professional development of settlement practitioners, and supporting the alignment of the workforce to the settlement outcomes and striving for excellence across the settlement workforce. Enhancing support for and encouraging the ongoing development of settlement providers is incredibly important. The everyday contribution of settlement providers is crucial as it truly makes a difference to the lives of vulnerable migrants and refugees as they settle into Australia. I first of all want to thank all of those who provide this important assistance in their everyday work. And the importance has never been more evident with the emergency evacuation of thousands of vulnerable people from Afghanistan over the last few months. And in many circumstances, they were landing in cities in lockdown. The collective efforts of the sector, the providers, the community and my department should be recognised. We brought 3,000 people here in the space of a few weeks. 75–80% went into Sydney and Melbourne who were in lockdown. The ability of providers who had to, retract their workforces over the preceding year due to lack of people arriving, the ability to ramp up, get the right support in place, work with people from arrival while in quarantine, and then obviously exit quarantine into their hands, has been a testament to the dedication and expertise of the people across the sector. And I want to just acknowledge that because I think it shows us at our best and is also a great framework for going forward with the competencies now giving us the opportunity to underpin the formalisation of the already known skills and experience of the people in the sector. The department looks forward to the positive impact that the National Workforce Competencies will make for providers and importantly for the continuing good outcomes that are being achieved for our clients. We will still have challenges going forward, but I would encourage all of those in the sector to work out how these competencies can underpin the quality of service provision, not only from providers, but also other parts of the sector, be they community groups, non-government organisations or other professional bodies that could benefit from understanding the importance of the competencies as an integral part of how the sector operates. I look forward to engaging further with you and ensuring that the settlement support provided to refugees and vulnerable migrants continues to be as effective as it can be. To finish, I would also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of the sector in working collaboratively for the good of clients. The development of the competencies through a collaboration of providers is just a great example of that. The government has also announced additional funding recently to assist with the Afghanistan resettlement, and it will broadly support community groups and legal practitioners as part of the broader settlement ecosystem. I'd also like to just note the recent launch of the MyAus multilingual app that MCA developed to assist the settlement and integration of migrants by providing authoritative and consistent information. In line with that, the department, I now have in my bailiwick, let's just call it pretty much everything English language. And we've doing a lot more work now on not only the provision of English language training and how that can support migrants on the ground, but the underpinning principles of English language. And we're hoping over the next 12 months to leverage off the good work done during the border lockdown period and borders closing in presentation of multilingual information to clients. With any luck, once we see the issue of multilingual starting points, moving into English language, looking at the way services are provided, the competencies, as we saw outlined just before, are broad. They focus on the core skills and capabilities required in the sector and articulate very clearly how we can measure those in terms of the effectiveness of staff in the sector who are delivering those services. So thank you again to Carla, her team, and all the contributors in the development of these standards. And I'm not sure of the protocol because, you know, launching often we think of champagne and chips. So I'll just wave my hand now and say, I now declare you launched. Back to you, Carla.
Lovely. And that's a fantastic royal wave. A hard thing to master. I'm going to open it up to the panel now. And what I might do is I might actually start, Paris, with you and talk to you. I mean, you've had a very long history in the sector and your leadership has been phenomenal over, you know, a long period of time. So I really want to talk to you about, you know, how do you see the competencies as being important, particularly in the current climate with the sector and as we start to move towards borders reopening? And I'll get you to unmute before you talk.
I'm muting now, thanks. Look, first of all, congratulations on producing the competencies. It is something that I've heard people talk about. In fact, I've talked about it myself for many, many years. If Margaret Piper was on the line, she would be going back. She would remember a lot of those conversations as well. So it's just a really important thing that the foundational work for producing these competencies has been done. And one of the main reasons why I think that's the case and why I think it's relevant to your question about the challenges is that they become important to establishing the validity of the work that everybody does. So the sector is full of very capable and highly skilled people, and a lot of the functions and the activities that we are engaged in doing require a multitude of skills that at the moment I don't think are fully appreciated. And one of the reasons why they're not fully appreciated is there isn't a clear framework. Like a lot of industries, you know, psychologists have their own set of competencies and guidelines for registration and so forth, and you could say the same about lots of different industries and so forth. And some of us have to comply with those different things already anyway. But settlement has never really had that framework that it can locate itself within, that provides an evidence base to the work, but properly reflects in an objective way the level of skill that exists and the value that it brings to, you know, making Australia a better place, let alone what it brings to the individual clients that we work with. So I think it is one of the values of having this is the degree to which it lifts the visibility and the understanding of the important work that the sector does. So I do. That's a real challenge for us. I think coming out of COVID, we've learned a lot during COVID, and there are new ways of operating that we've been compelled to both contemplate and apply, including working remotely, including using different platforms and technology, including thinking about collaborations in different ways. I think one of our challenges as we move out of lockdown is how do we take all of the best of that and apply it to lift our capacity moving forward into the future, and doing it in a professional way that is recognised as such by not just Home Affairs as one of the funding agencies, but most agencies receive funding from a multitude of different services, different government departments and funding sources. So for me, this is part of establishing a platform for us to keep building on, and that's really important as we move out of the pressures that have happened as a consequence of COVID. And there are other things perhaps I can come back to later about some of the specific challenges facing the sector as well, because I do think as we move forward, one of the big challenges is how do we move away from what has predominantly been at one level a highly competitive environment that has kind of been driven a lot by growth, because for growth's sake, in some cases, sometimes the growth has just been fantastic and wonderful. But how do we strengthen collegiality and the ability to bring everybody in the sector along and lift all of us up in terms of what we do moving forward? And I think that is a real challenge for us. There's a lot of collegiality and a lot of collaboration that happens, but there's always this overarching umbrella around competition and so forth, which has a dampening effect on the true potential that comes from collegiality and collaboration. So I think as a sector, that's one of the big things that we've got in front of us.
Thank you, Paris, and agree completely. Christine, I might pick up on the point around, in particular, how the perception of the sector often gets framed. And you've come from a long history in government prior to moving into the settlement sector, and you spoke to me the other day about what it was like to walk into a settlement agency and to take up that new role within the community sector. Can you talk a bit about why sort of competencies might be quite important from a government perspective more broadly as well?
Yeah, sure, Carla. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Yagara and Turrbal lands, the traditional owners, and pay my respects to elders throughout all time, and also congratulate MCA on your work that you've done in leading, I think, the development of the competencies framework. Multicultural Australia has been a very keen participant. As you said, it's been a sector-led piece as well, which I think speaks to, the commitment of everyone who's been involved in the process. Certainly, yeah, I think having this competencies framework is going to be really important from both the sectors and from government's perspective, because what it does, I think it sets the frame for what is obviously very complex work that we do. And the way I describe our work, so our work has a number of dimensions here. It's both personal and it's professional. It's personal in that it has to be person-centered. We have to remember the human beings who are at the center of everything that we do. But obviously we need to be professional in terms of the expertise we bring to the role, the expertise that our clients deserve with the services that we provide to them. And then the work is also multifaceted, it's multidimensional, and it's multi-layered. And if you think about that journey for new arrivals, right from that first arrival at the airport through housing, life skills, education, health, employment, all of these are really complex areas in their own right, even whether it be in government or in mid sector, in terms of service providers. And what the settlement sector does, it plays in all of those spaces. And in that sense, then having a very clear overarching competency framework, I think, becomes really, really important in terms of ensuring that we do it well. And if I could focus on some of the key domains, I think again, that we have in the competencies framework. So if you look at communication, for example, where you think about the complexities around services and the framework and the capabilities needing to be multilingual, multicultural, they need to be calm and compassionate, they need to be adaptive, they need to be ethical, because we're dealing with really, really important information in terms of privacy considerations, but then thinking through about information sharing that needs to happen, that is really, really vital to collaboration, which is another domain within the competencies framework. So where we all need to be really, really collaborative and really important, really collegiate in terms of working within our teams, working within our organisations, working within our sector, working with government, and that sector encompasses government and all of the providers, and then working within broader community. Again, having those core competencies that we're all working towards, I think will facilitate that, which ultimately then leads, I think, to yet another one of the domains, which is, I think, really, really important, is around that professionalism of the sector. And I think both David and Paris have alluded to the need to actually recognise the particular unique capabilities, skills, and challenges that the sector kind of deals with and needs to be recognised for. But in terms of, if we're going to claim to be doing really, really important work as a sector, we also need to be equally rigorous about what we accept and promote in terms of the core capabilities. And this is where professionalism becomes really, really important, because we're doing important work here. We're dealing with the most vulnerable people in the world in terms of the people that we deal with. And we need to have the right people who are given the right support, trained with the right skills. One of the things I particularly like about the professionalism core competency is also how it has self-care and resilience woven into it as a domain, as opposed to being something that's kind of quite separate. So those issues around resilience, health, well-being of our workforce being a really, really important bit. So I think what the competencies framework does here then is actually does bring a whole range of really, really important, I've just touched on some of them, domains together, which kind of sets those standards, which are absolutely vital if we are going to ensure that we don't compromise good outcomes for people in our clients, the people we deal with within the settlement sector. Recognizing that very often for all of us who play in this sector, whether we're government, whether we are settlement providers, whether we are one of those areas that support the settlement journey, their experience and their journey is often in our hands. There are touch points which can make all the difference to a person's life, and we need to actually honour that responsibility, give respect to this responsibility. I think the competencies framework will play a really, really important role in supporting us to do this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Christine. And Bernie, if I can come over to you. One of the ways in which the competencies are framed is they are aspirational. So in terms of engaging with volunteer workers and people who are entering the settlement sector and then working their way up towards other positions. Why is it, how do you see, for instance, your agency is engaging with volunteers around the competencies?
Yeah, thanks, Carla, and hello everyone. And I'll just acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on the land on which I'm speaking to you from today, to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and congratulate all of my peers and Carla and your team for putting the competency framework together. Picking up on your point about the significance of the competencies to the new and emerging workforce, if you like, and volunteers included, I think what it does is it creates a signpost, I suppose, if in many ways, through which people can understand and look at the development pathway into this really important life-changing work that we actually do. So we come from a really strong place, we come from strong foundations, we come from a long history of providing great outcomes based around some really significant skills and experience and things like cultural competence, bilingual and bicultural, social and interpersonal skills. And many of the people who are coming to the settlement space are coming from a lived experience of a refugee or a migrant, which is really, really powerful indeed as well. So what the competencies can do is create that journey and that pathway through and surround that with a professional development framework that will actually help and assist that and empower the new and emerging workforce as we go forward.
Fantastic. And Rana, Mayan's been obviously really instrumental in terms of putting a youth lens through this. If you could talk a little bit about a youth perspective and why having specific competencies around youth and an acknowledgement of youth-based expertise is particularly important within the settlement sector.
Thank you, Carla. And I'm meeting you from Wurundjeri land by the beautiful bank of Mullumbulun Creek that kept us sane during this lockdown, the long lockdown in Melbourne. We could walk there and relax. And I pay my respect to the elders past and present. Thank you so much. And I really congratulate you for the comprehensive framework. And it's really exciting to see the use-specific competencies, and it's so great to see. And it was a great collaboration to add the use lens to this framework. It's actually a really good question, because young people are comprising during the last 10 years continuously almost 1/3 of the migration program, and they spend the majority of their life in Australia. They continuously and consistently demonstrated their important contribution to the economic, social, and civic life of Australia. And they have specific needs and specific strengths that in the settlement context, that we, without targeting the responses across the settlement services continuum, we may put them at risk of long-term social, economic, and civic marginalization. And for that reason, we need to have this specific lens and pay special attention to them.
Fantastic. And I should also acknowledge I'm coming from Ngunnawal land and pay my respects to elders past and present. David, if I can come back to you and ask you, why is it important that the framework and the competencies are a living document? If you can talk a little bit about that, and how it has the potential to evolve through the reform process as well. You're on mute, David. Yep.
No, I'm not. I just don't move with quite the elegance that others do. Look, I think it's really important that we are always prepared for tomorrow, not just looking back at where we've come from. The nature of these documents they are developed at a point in time, and as we've seen with be it technology or changing environments, the way that you package skills into jobs, the way jobs change, and then the way that you prepare people to work in those environments is going to evolve all the time. So the concept of having a living document, particularly as, we're going, let's face it, a lot of the settlement sector is funded through public sector organisations. It's a good grounding point for us as we go through. We'll, as we do regularly, go through another round where we need to look at who our providers are, how we fund them. We need to look at how we have, and Bernie raised that very good point about the volunteers and those who don't necessarily are on a payroll anywhere, but are very important contributors. As the environment or the ecosystem we operate in changes, the competencies are the grounding point upon which we look to, but they can also, as the world changes, if we move into different models of delivery, we can also then start to adjust those for those elements that are required. The question of professionalisation of workforces always arises with competencies, and that, you then get into the whole argument about qualifications and recognition, etc. I think they are very important discussions to have and can play a key role. So some organisations might want to totally professionalise their workforce. They will now, once we get through the curriculum development phase and the accreditation phase, there will be ways for people to train on the job, have their competencies recognised, and then, if you like, get their qualification. But by the same token, we might have very small or community-based organisations that don't have the funding or wherewithal to develop staff. The competencies themselves are going to be the thing they point to say, I know what to measure ourselves against, even if we don't do it formally. As with any competency standards or curriculum, being contemporary is very important. So that process of review will be ongoing, and I anticipate that every few years we'll see things tweaked, strengthened. We will find when they're out there, particularly in those first few years, is the grouping of competencies against a particular principle right? Is the level for the entry level, mid-level or higher level appropriate, or do they come up and down? So we should always have that monitoring process going underneath, because the minute that it's not providing the accurate and best information is the minute they become redundant to people who want to use it on a day-to-day basis.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. And Paris, if I can come back to you, in terms of a document which really is ascribed to all of the varied practices of the settlement sector, why is it important that we create a framework that has a degree of workforce consistency to it?
Well, because I think that's the only way that as a sector we can argue the capability to deliver, work at a standard that, frankly, is worthy of taxpayer investment. Like if we want governments to invest even more in what we do, then having a framework that can help validate the importance of that and the effectiveness of it, it just becomes an essential part as more and more as governments move towards wanting more evidence before they agree to provide additional funding into programs and areas and so forth. The other thing that they'll be looking for is evidence about whether or not the agencies receiving the funding or the sector they're investing in actually has the capability to deliver it. And if you think about it, that's entirely legitimate on the part of any government wanting to utilise taxpayer dollars effectively and fairly. And so I just think it becomes really critical to our ability to progress forward. And I have been in this space for 33 years, and the level of investment when I first started compared to what the level of investment is now is poles apart. Like there is much, much more investment in this space, and that's largely because there's been more recognition of the importance of the work and the fantastic work that so many agencies have been delivering on. But ironically, we've never really got to the point of being able to also embed that in an overarching framework that does carry everyone with it. And that's what I think the value of this is. I've been around long enough to know that what this is a fantastic document that provides a great platform, and as we go, we will keep adding to it and building on it and informing it with our practice and our work into the future as new evidence comes out. I mean, if I was to think about in my own organisation, the level of, the depth in terms of the evidence and the capability and in our work today compared to 30 years ago is vastly different. And we've adapted styles and modes of intervention and created new modes of intervention and established new standards for ourselves throughout that time. This gives us the opportunity to do that across the sector as a whole and hopefully get it recognised for the work to a much greater degree than it has been in the past. I mean, I did mention earlier about the challenges we face around collegiality. That wasn't a comment that we don't operate collegially at the moment, but we do it in patches, and sometimes it's done. The collaboration is about competition with another group. And I think there is a responsibility of government to think of different ways of supporting the sector to operate over the longer term in a way where it keeps lifting standards for everyone. And I'm not sure all of the funding streams have necessarily allowed for that in the past. But again, these things, like the framework that the council's put together, and I think David made the point, and others, it was put together in partnership with a whole range of other organisations. It just adds a very important plank into what the future of the sector can look like as we move forward. So I guess I'll leave it at that. But that's certainly. The other thing that I should say too is that if we want a partnership with government, where we're working collaboratively with government in developing policy and programs and services, and where we want government to be respectful of the ideas and the positions and the views that we are able to express, then being able to demonstrate our competencies to do that is an essential component as well. So I'll leave it there.
If you don't mind, Carla, I might just jump in there because I think Paris made some very important points there, you know, about how government views the sector and how government works with the sector. And in particular, if you look at the current contractual arrangements, we have had, it's been a real battle being able to deal with COVID because they were so highly restrictive. And I don't think the contracts themselves were something that facilitated collaboration. It more highlighted, you know, the requirement for adherence. So when COVID came along, you know, my guys have had to bend contract arrangements as far as they can to make sure the sector has an ongoing stream. With Afghanistan arriving, we've had a number of approaches from SETS providers saying we may need additional funding. Well, I don't disagree with the principle, but what we've got is an environment where the current contractual arrangements have us, you know, allocating based on a day, you know, a certain period of time going forward to give funding certainty, but then that reduces flexibility. So I think Paris is right that certainly once you've got things like competency standards, we got something common to point at that underpins everything we do. However, that we next time we go out looking at how we design, and we'll obviously work very closely with the sector through the next phase, is should we be looking when we go to contract next time, look to replicate what we have today? I'll go out on a limb here and say probably not. But what we do want to do is work out what are those underpinning principles of, you know, collaboration and unity and single purpose and client focus that says, if we do it at the moment in sort of rudimentary ways. If someone settles for 6 months and then they move towns, we pass the funding to the other provider. Yeah, that's all well and good. But I wouldn't say that's a client-centric approach. That is more a adherence to contractual requirement approach. We need to define collectively as a sector what good settlement looks like, and then what are those moving parts that contribute to it. And then once we understand that deeply, which I think we already on some level do, how do you turn that into a process where government can say, for $200 million a year, I need to acquit back to my ministers what we're delivering. How do we maximise what that investment can do by utilising all parts of the sector in appropriate ways, funded to appropriate levels? So I think Paris makes some very good points, and we're not unaware of the challenge, but I think the next 12 months is a really great opportunity for us to work collaboratively on what would a future look like before we, you know, look at going out to market to actually engage providers. Thanks, Carla.
Thanks. And Bernie, you've got your hand up, so I'm sensing you might want to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. And I just want to pick up on a point Paris made and acknowledge, 33 years is an enormous contribution, but it's what you were saying, Paris, I guess, reflected the evolution of the settlement service and practice over the 33 years. And to now we're at another moment in time, I guess. And when I reflect on it, I think what we're experiencing now is there's more expected of settlement practitioners as a professional discipline than ever before. And those expectations are coming from all sorts of places. We see many of the service systems that surround us and that we reach out to are all in a reform agenda, if you like. We've got women's safety, family violence, child safety, mental health reform, aged care reform, community expectations around racism and the like are shifting as well. And obviously COVID's had a significant sort of impact on the expectations of us to be able to mobilise community and community capacity building at a really important time. So all of those expectations are shifting, and because we work with and work across and within a lot of those particular service systems, we have to shift and adapt as well, and continue to develop our professional discipline and practice to accommodate that in a way that's going to deliver the best outcomes for our clients.
Fantastic. Did anyone else from the panel want to jump in?
I might just have a quick word, Carla. Some of the thinking I'm doing, and this is around the comments that were made around the competencies framework being iterative, and the really important piece about it also being tiered and the extent to which we use it. Certainly a big challenge for us as a settlement provider is around ensuring we do have that degree of professionalisation and the qualifications that people have, but balancing that out as well with having our workforce reflect our client base and the challenges there for people who are newly arrived, settled to a point where they potentially could start working within the sector, how we build up that capability so that the sector then also has that diversity within the workforce. And that's a progressive piece in terms of how you might achieve that. And particularly like how the competencies are tiered within the competency framework, because it allows you to do that. And certainly as a provider and as an employer within this space, I think there's a really important support that the framework will provide to us, not only in terms of our recruitment, but also in terms of our ongoing professional development for our staff as we move out in terms of framing those frames. But there's a really important piece as we have conversations about the professionalisation of the settlement sector. I think that we will continually need to maintain that balance to ensure that we're not inadvertently excluding the people who we think, who will need a bit more support to actually also participate as employees within the sector, so that the very people that we're actually supporting as clients should also then be on those pathways to employment, certainly more broadly, but also within the settlement sector.
Fantastic. If I can stay with you, Christine, for a second, one of your passion areas in your background has been in family and domestic violence. In terms of recognising the complexity, particularly the kind of degree to which settlement workers need to be across so many different domains of expertise. How important is it that we start to recognise and put in place pathways for training for particular points of expertise?
Yeah, absolutely vital. And it's part of a really important conversation that's happening in Queensland at the moment, because there is an inquiry into coercive control, and there's obviously a lot of ongoing work in the domestic and family violence space, which we are staying very engaged in. And particularly in terms of ensuring that, that we're continuing to be that voice that says, yes, there's this really important issue around domestic and family violence in the broader community, but when it comes to our called community, there are very specific issues, and particularly for our new arrivals in terms of language, in terms of cultural understanding, in terms of knowing what is and isn't lawful in this country. All of those things are just a fundamental part and can be a very time-consuming part, and also a very significant disruption to achieving settlement outcomes if you actually don't acknowledge and recognize that issue. There's some very specific issues here in that for some of our new arrivals around kind of in actually understanding, knowing, recognizing what domestic and family violence is, and how you then tie that in with cultural and religious norms and all of those sorts of things, and being culturally sensitive, culturally appropriate in terms of how you deal with it, but at the same time having that conversation about culture never ever being an excuse for violence and unlawful behavior, and how you get that messaging around. So if you think about that as a specialist area, a specialist area that exists in its own right, which is very complex in its own piece, and then thinking about the capability and capacity of our employees, people working with our clients in this workforce in the midst of a whole range of other complex issues, it becomes fundamentally important. Certainly it is one space that we are doing a lot of work in terms of awareness, in terms of skills and capacity building, but I think it just highlights the significant challenges that face people who work in this sector, and the significant responsibility that they carry to do it right. Because if you don't get it right, we are literally talking about, life and death type implications if you don't get it right, and people's issues around safety, as well as then ultimately coming to that broader issue about you're not going to achieve successful settlement outcome if the individual is living within a household where they are not safe, where they've escaped from a country to achieve safety in Australia, but not ultimately achieve safety because of then being trapped within the home or the family that they're living in.
Absolutely. Rana, I can see you want to jump in.
Yes, I actually wanted to echo everyone else and add the fact that what we have as competencies, as person-based and cultural-based, are based on dynamic culture, ever-changing cultures and ever-changing human beings. And the pace of the change has become very fast right now because of the COVID. And there are new needs coming up, like the digital accessibility, that we need a new set of competency and having understanding of what are these needs, and even having an understanding how to assess the needs. So I guess it's really, really necessary for any type of framework that we have to be dynamic, to be flexible in life, to be able to adapt quickly to the changes.
Fantastic. And in the few minutes we've got left, what I might do is just ask for final reflections from each of the panel members. If I can start with you, David.
Thanks, Carla. And look, I think we've been just in this panel discussion, we've covered an enormous amount of issues of where we are today and where we need to go. And I think all I would like to say about the future is the opportunities are great for collaboration, not only across the sector, but also with government, through not just ourselves, but state and territories, etc. We had one problem this year on funding because it just happened with no consultation, because why would we? One funding stream from the state government and one funding stream from the Common finished at the same time, which had very large ramifications for a provider. So that concept, one of the things I'm taking forward is the collaboration is broad and deep. It goes to government, it goes to sector, government of all colours, sector of all colours. So making sure we stay engaged, as I said, the competencies and the curriculum that follow is a really good starting point for that.
Thank you. Paris.
Hi, Carla. Well, again, it's just my last chance. Congratulations to MCA on producing this with all of the groups that you produced it with. One of the things that we're talking about the importance of this to the sector, I wouldn't want to disregard the fact that it's actually very important to workers, individual workers, as well as their managers and the specific agencies, because it gives us something that workers can help guide people around what their practice needs to look like and how they might apply it. It helps agencies think through the types of assessment procedures that they might develop and go through, and the case review processes and all of those sorts of things. So done well, as long as we don't overcomplicate it, it becomes a really useful thing right down at that level. And I think it's one of the areas where this is different to the production of frameworks for sectors and so forth. This is actually, the competencies part of it is something that sits in a framework and that helps add, if you like, robustness or rigour to the way in which we want to see things being applied overall. So, in terms of the different systems that are in place and the funding streams and service delivery programs that are that operate. So having good competencies helps build rigour into the individual practice, the operations of services, and then therefore the benefit of the sector, and that then feeds into overarching frameworks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Christine.
Thanks, Carla. I think we've covered a lot of really, really important points, but for me, probably one of the most important points was the conversation around how this is an iterative and dynamic framework, and it's really, really important that it be seen as a kind of a platform or a starting point. And in that context, then the onus is on all of us within the sector, as service providers, as government, regardless of your role as individuals in the workforce and as leaders, to actually seize this opportunity, to actually use it, to make it work, and to continually improve on it. And I think that's a really, really important piece, because we've got a really fantastic opportunity in this document where it's brought a lot of good thinking together led by the sector. And I think I'd be really keen for us to kind of be framing it and viewing it as an opportunity for us to take some really important steps forward and not missing the opportunity we have with the launch of this document.
Fantastic. Rana.
Well, I want to acknowledge one point about the framework itself. It's a very practical and pragmatic tool. And in macro level, it will help the resourcing and distribution of the competency in smaller teams, bigger teams. It's a great help to which affects the efficiency and the performance of the workforce. So it helps us to have a more consistent work and communicate easier with the other parts of it, avoid replication in different organizations. So I think it's a great tool in general, and we talked about the quality and the efficiency, and all of this together, as Pai said, it will help us to recognize the level of the work that the sector is doing.
Bernie, lucky last.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. I suppose lucky last, I think I'll probably reflect by posing a challenge, if I like. And one of the competencies talks to leadership, and it's a significant one in itself. And I think it probably talks to a lot of the people in the conversation today. And I think there's a challenge for us as leaders in this space to really create a powerful vision for the future of settlement, and one that really sort of mobilises our workforce and communities around it. And two, for us as leaders to really enact that vision and support our teams and our practitioners to embrace opportunities for growth and development, I guess. And that's going to need us to make decisions to invest in that space as well, and to collaborate with each other and to share knowledge and practice. So really, powerful opportunity for us as leaders to really enact a really exciting vision, I think, for the future.
Fantastic. And if I can end off by saying that, I would love to get back to in-person events, because it would be so much nicer to have everyone in a room together. But secondly, just to say that I really want to acknowledge that this is very much a collaborative document. The competencies themselves very much came out of a suggestion from a working group as part of SETSCoP. I really want to say that the SETSCoP for us has just been a fantastic experience in how we can create those points of collaboration across the sector. And I really want to acknowledge how much work, this isn't a document that MCA produced, this is very much a document that the sector has produced, and we're very honoured to be part of that process. So thank you very much to everyone. And on that note, I will let everyone have lunch. Thank you, and thank you very much to the panelists and to David for officially launching it.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.